Hello, I'm William Robinson, and I'm from the University of California at Santa Barbara. I regret that I cannot zoom in live to this panel because where I am, it's 2 a.m. Um, but I want to jump right into my presentation, and I've been researching and writing about the crisis of global capitalism for over a decade now. And in my view, we are seeing an epochal crisis of global capitalism. It's multidimensional. It is structural. It's a political crisis of legitimacy and capitalist hegemony. It is a crisis of global social reproduction, and of course, an ecological crisis, which makes it existential. Why I suggest that this is an epochal crisis is because we're seeing the conditions for capitalist reproduction are gradually becoming exhausted. And I don't mean that in the next few years we're going to see a collapse of global capitalism, or even in the next few decades, but through the course of this century and into early next century, I don't think global capitalism, will be able to reproduce itself. But focusing now specifically on the pandemic, I want to develop the linkage here between the pandemic and the crisis. But let me start by saying the pandemic, in my view, was a blessing for the ruling groups in two senses. One, it allowed for accelerated accumulation at a time when there was worldwide stagnation, and it allowed for a tremendous increase in the ability of the ruling groups to impose social control on the global working and popular classes. Yeah, the irony here is that what took place through the pandemic is only going to aggravate, in the long term, this epochal crisis of global capitalism. What I propose to do now in the 15 to 20 minutes that I have is look at three of these four dimensions of the crisis, starting with the structural dimension, that of over-accumulation and long-term stagnation. If we took the story back to the last structural crisis prior to the one we're in now, that would be in the 1970s. And capital responded to that crisis. The ruling groups responded by launching globalization as a way to escape the nation state constraints to accumulation. And that led to a boom in the emerging globally integrated economy in the late 1980s into the 1990s. But that lasted very long, very short, the globalization boom. By 2008, we had the global financial collapse, the Great Recession, and that signaled the start of a new long-term structural crisis of the system, which is still continuing in 2023. Now, for decades, it's certainly since the early 20th century, the debate between Rosa Luxemburg's take and Enrique Grossman's take, radical and Marxist political economists have debated whether overaccumulation crises are due to a falling rate of profit, and that would be in the circuit of production, or due to overproduction under consumption in the circuit of circulation. I suggest that these two dimensions are not at all incompatible. To the contrary, they form a single unity. And if I'll go into that in a little more detail in just a moment. But in fact, there has been a steady decline in the rate of profit worldwide over the last 50 years. And with the one exception that in several years in the 1990s, the rate of profit recovered. But there's been a secular decline worldwide, varying from country to country, but that secular decline with the aggregate worldwide data is very clear. And of course, what's happening here is that the introduction of technologies with regard to the profit rate, the introduction of new technologies, especially digital technologies, and that's a large part of the story here of the pandemic and of crisis, have increased the organic composition of capital. These new technologies, there's the first round of technologies was computer information technology, was introduced and basically spread all over the global economy from the 1980s and the 1990s and on. But now we have a new generation of digital technologies, especially artificial intelligence, machine learning, the collection, processing and analysis of enormous amounts of data, big data, and the Internet of Things. These are the key, foundations of the whole new technology. And if they are going to be introduced now into the global economy, that will massively increase the organic composition of capital and therefore aggravate in the long term the rate of profit, the decline in the rate of profit. This is linked to the pandemic because the COVID was really a key turning point in which these new technologies were introduced in an accelerated fashion across the board. So I want to pause for a minute to say something about what we call the productivity paradox, meaning that these new technologies have had over the last 30, 40 years, and especially the newer ones, right, artificial intelligence and so forth, to radically increase productivity, but they haven't done so yet. And one reason for this, I'm arguing, is that capital had the opportunity to either introduce these technologies in the core countries and get and that's one way of making profit. But the other, in other words, seek out an increase in relative surplus value. The other option it had, and this was opened up through globalization, was to seek out absolute surplus value by the whole, as the story was well known, the transfer of industry to low wage zones. But here's the thing. The pandemic and its aftermath underscored the fragility of global supply chains and problems in how the global economy has been organized from the 1980s up until the pandemic. So we're seeing right now a new spatial reconfiguration. It's already underway. And people are talking about both capitalists, states, and scholars are talking about reshoring and nearshoring. Some people speak of deglobalization. I think that's a mistake. That's not really taking place, but let's go with it for the moment. But here's the thing. The changes involved in nearshoring, reshoring, deglobalization, and the introduction of these technologies is going to only aggravate in the long run the crisis of over accumulation. And I want to point out something here in this regard, that what we saw from the late 1960s and on was increasing automation in industry in the core countries. And that's not fully automated, but there's a tremendous advance in automation so that the industrial working classes in the core countries have greatly been reduced. We all know that. This is not new to observe that. And so what's happened in the core countries is massively the labor force moves into the service sector, both personal services and especially general services. And those have yet to be radically digitalized. But now in the wake of the pandemic, they stand to be radically digitalized. So you're going to have precarious labor and massive under and unemployment in the core countries, because those that move from industry into services are now going to be pushed into that structural relationship of under and unemployment and of precarious forms of employment. Whereas the return of industry from the global south, but more significantly, I don't think we're going to see that in a massive scale. Some of it we're going to see, but also the automation of industry in the global south. So whether you look at global north or global south, we're going to see an increase in the organic composition of capital, but also, so we're going to see an intensification of the structural bases for overaccumulation. But the other side, that's why I was saying that there's a unity of the sphere of circulation and sphere of production on the underconsumption overproduction side, because of automation, especially of services in the core and really the periphery for that matter as well. We're going to see a rise in surplus humanity, in mass under and unemployment and precarious forms of employment. And so on both sides, circulation and production, we're going to see an aggravation of the structural dimension. The second dimension of the crisis linked to the pandemic is that of social reproduction. And so it's no secret to point out that worldwide, several billions of people face daily crises of survival, and that's gotten worse and worse and worse over the last 50 years of globalization, but intensified with and through the pandemic. Now, a crisis of survival is not necessarily a crisis for capitalism. For capital, it is only under two circumstances. One of those circumstances is when it produces a crisis in labor markets. How do you keep on, under these conditions, how do you keep on pumping out surplus value? Or if so many people cannot consume, then it's also, and that's the linkage here with the previous points, which was overproduction under consumption. Then you also have a crisis for capital. A crisis of survival becomes a crisis for capital. The second way that a crisis of survival for billions of people becomes that of capital as well is when that struggle for survival leads to mass resistance, to fight back. And then it's a crisis of social control for the ruling groups. And so that's exactly what we're seeing on both of these dimensions right now. Now, we know that capitalism, by its very nature, produces all of this wealth but polarizes it. And so inequality is not a fluke in the capitalist system. It's intrinsic to capitalism, and it's if we don't see a rise in inequality, is because there's countervailing tendencies from the after the Great Depression, the midst and after the Great Depression of the 1930s. Those countervailing tendencies was redistribution and regulation by the state through the Fortas-Keynesian model of capitalism. But then the ruling groups were able to break out of that model of capitalism, impose the neoliberal model through globalization. And so that unleashed this massive, unprecedented levels of global inequality that we're all familiar with from the 1980s right to present. We all know this data. 1% of humanity controls over 50% of the world's wealth. 20% of humanity controls 95% of the world's wealth. So here you have 80% of humanity that has to make do with just 5% of the world's wealth. So the global economy expands what it can produce, but the global market cannot absorb that production. The International Labor Organization, and of course I'm simplifying and accelerating things. I'm trying to pack everything into my 20 minutes. And therefore cannot unpack everything. But the ILO points out that 3.3 billion workers in the world are either structurally under or unemployed or precariously employed. So we're going to have a new round of global capitalist expansion in extractive industries and actually all over. I can't get into details on that now, but part of that expansion also involves not just a extensive enlargement of capitalism, but its intensive expansion through an acceleration of commodification. And part of that story is the privatization of social reproduction that we know, healthcare, utilities, education, and so forth. So this new round of expansion coming after the pandemic is going to aggravate the crisis of social reproduction. By the way, the Oxfam 2023 report said that 3/4 of the world's governments are planning this over the next 5 years austerity driven spending cuts in the areas of social reproduction to the tune of $8 trillion. So the pandemic, therefore, not only during the pandemic itself, there was a radical heightening of inequality. In the United States, the ultra-wealthy increased their wealth by $1 trillion in just the first 6 months of the pandemic. And worldwide, billionaires' wealth increased by 27% in the first 4 months of the pandemic. So the pandemic accelerated this inequality, and the structural changes now coming out of the pandemic are going to further deepen that worldwide inequality. A couple other points here, because I noticed that I only have about 5 minutes left, is that from 2008 to 2021, the strategy of the capitalist state and of capital, especially the financial sector, in the face of this prolonged stagnation, has been quantitative easing, injecting $35 trillion into the financial system and largely subsidizing capital and keeping the global economy going in the face of the otherwise long-term stagnation. And then during the pandemic, another $8 trillion was injected to the financial system, but also given to transnational corporations. That's $8 trillion as bailouts. So the corporations radically increased their profit making at a time when the majority of the global working and popular classes suffered sudden drop in their income and in their stability. So especially you have this block which consolidated during the pandemic of big tech, big pharma, the medical industrial complex, the military industrial complex, and finance. So profits gravitate to that block of capital. Pfizer, for instance, in 2021, registered an unbelievable $32 billion in profits. That's not revenue, that's just profits. Moderna's growth was 7,170% in 2021. And part of that story here, coming out of the pandemic, is we've moved from intermittent global vaccine markets to now emerging from the pandemic with permanent global vaccine markets. Those details are a discussion for somewhere else. And also according to The Economist, during the pandemic, annual manufacturing capacity for vaccine doses increased from 5.7 billion doses to 15.4 billion doses. So I'm just giving this data as sort of an indication of this rising block of capital, of how it's intensifying inequality, and also leading to a new biopolitical regime that I don't have time to discuss right now. But remember also during the pandemic that big tech's market value surpassed for all of the big tech companies surpassed $1 trillion, first time in the history of world capitalism. And the profits of big tech plus big pharma plus finance now dwarf in the profits of any industrial sector, except the oil companies currently, therefore aggravating the contradiction of stagnation in the productive economy. And finally, on this point of the crisis of social reproduction and inequality, is that the new technologies being introduced are going to be radically transforming the labor process, particularly disaggregating the labor process and further de-skilling. And that's only going to aggravate the crisis of social reproduction. So the third dimension of this crisis, all linked together with inequality and with the pandemic, is that of legitimacy and capitalist hegemony. So there's two things going on here. One is that the capitalist states face legitimacy crises, and the capitalist system faces a crisis of its ideological hegemony over the masses. And there's also a crisis of hegemony in the international system, leading to escalating geopolitical conflict. But what I want to point out here is that starting in 2008 with the global financial collapse, the global revolt radically took off and radically expanded. And on the eve of the pandemic, we really had, in fall 2019, a people spring, a crescendo in this global revolt. And so that's why it's a blessing in disguise. At that exact moment, in this crescendo of the global revolt 2019, the pandemic comes along. It allows the ruling groups to impose a giant experiment of mass social control and surveillance. The pandemic, in fact, was a dry one for how digitalization is going to allow the dominant groups now to step up the restructuring of time and space in function of greater social control over the global working and popular classes. In fact, we saw during the pandemic, and it has not been pulled back, it's continued to intensify, a vast expansion of state and private surveillance. And again, that new biopolitical regime I mentioned. But also, in terms of social control in response to the crisis of legitimacy and capitalist hegemony, the pandemic allowed the ruling groups around the world to declare what we can call medical martial law. On the 158 governments used emergency powers to declare these emergencies, public health emergencies, and through them ban protests, harass dissidents, censored journalists and the public in general, similar to what we saw in 9/11, but even much more intensified in many ways. And these emergency decrees and massive increase in social control and surveillance was justified by the pandemic. But there's no evidence whatsoever that this extreme control and the control over people's movement stopped the spread of COVID. In fact, it had nothing to do with COVID and its spread. And the fact is, capitalist states around the world could not cope with the pandemic and the socioeconomic implosion that it caused. And so these capitalist states were exposed as these callous instruments of wealth and of corruption, which they are, of course. And so this only aggravated, the whole pandemic aggravated the crisis of legitimacy and capitalist hegemony. But without being able to go into detail, one comment on the geopolitical dimension I was mentioning, and that is that as capitalist states around the world face this ongoing crisis of legitimacy, they need to sublimate and externalize mass social anxiety generated by the crisis itself. And so, of course, that's linked to the discussion of the new Cold War and geopolitical conflict, militarized accumulation, but I have no time to go into that here. So I am at 18 minutes according to this recording. I will just conclude with a final comment. I want to say, now this is going to be controversial, but I really don't care. I will not censor myself, that the particular response of capitalist states and of capital itself, big pharma, etc., to the pandemic was only one possible response of others we could have had. There was nothing inevitable about it. And the transnational capitalist class and capitalist states, the ruling groups, had already planned out how they would respond to any pandemic that came along well before this pandemic. A decade before this pandemic, they already had their response planned out. And they rolled it out like a juggernaut, and a lot of the population, the left included, left scholars, progressive scholars included, just followed whatever the state said about all of this and censored anyone that had any different view on the pandemic and on the science, and based on the science itself. So I want to give you an example because this is so dangerous, and I'm concluding with this, that in the first 6 months of the pandemic, 3 million YouTubes were banned and taken down. Facebook, Twitter, all of these, anyone that had any questioning of the official narrative coming from capitalist states and from big pharma was censored. Now, some of that was misinformation. Okay, some of that was conspiracy theory, but a very significant portion of it was based in the science and different interpretations of the science, yet it was completely suppressed because it undermined the profit-making strategy that had been worked out 10 years earlier. That is very dangerous because now as we move into the intensification of the crisis of global capitalism and more inequality and more conflict and more struggle from below, we have a new regime of censorship which has been legitimated through the pandemic and with the blessing, I'm going to say it again, of a significant portion of the left worldwide and of us critical scholars. I mean, and I'll conclude with this. I promise I will conclude with this, but just look at the case of gain of whether this came out of a laboratory or not. Anyone that questioned that, even though there was evidence right from the beginning that there was gain of function properties to this virus, anyone that questioned it was said you're a conspiracy theorist. But fast forward 3 years later, we now have Jeffrey Sachs, an incredible person with an incredible intellect and total political integrity, headed the Lancet Commission report and said it's very, very likely that it did come out from a laboratory because of the gain of function properties. Now we can say that. But for 3 years we were all censored, and now we have this new censorship regime going into a period of intensified global inequalities, intensified global crisis. I'll stop there. Thank you.